My mother-in-law is overly devout. While I was away, she forced my daughter to drink holy water that had already turned green. Because of her faith, I lost my child, and she blamed me because I'm not a believer. I never thought my life would resemble a surrealistic drama, but Irina, my mother-in-law, managed to make it so. She's a woman of considerable age, but full of energy, especially when it comes to religion. She's always been a pillar of her church, and unfortunately, her passion knows no bounds. When I first met her, I immediately knew she was special. She gave me an icon during our first meeting, which hinted at her deep religiosity. I politely thanked her, but that was just the beginning. During our first dinner together, she prayed so loudly and emotionally that even the neighbor's dog started howling. My first thought was, well, this will be interesting. Little did I know just how interesting it would become. My husband Mark is Irina's only son, and she absolutely adores him. Mark has always tried to please his mother, which made my position even more difficult. I tried to build a relationship with her, but Irina always saw me through the lens of her beliefs. She believes that Mark grew up to be a worthy man thanks to her influence, and she expects me to follow all of her religious traditions. The first few months after our wedding were tough. We lived under the same roof as Irina, and she insisted on filling our home with religious symbols and rituals. Every morning, she would light candles and say prayers, and in the evenings, she demanded that we all gather for family Bible readings. I tried to participate to avoid conflicts, but it became increasingly challenging. Each day, Irina interfered more and more in our personal lives. She criticized me for working instead of staying home, for how I dressed, how I cooked, and even how I spoke. Her criticism never ceased, and she always found a way to point out my flaws, linking them to my lack of religious devotion. Every meal felt like we were in a church rather than at home. Irina always managed to turn a simple meal into a religious ritual. Once, as we sat down to eat, she unexpectedly declared that everyone must read a passage from the Bible before starting. Mark, as usual, supported her, and I felt I had no choice but to comply. The passage I got was about obedience, and Irina didn't miss the chance to emphasize how important it was for the family, especially the wife. She looked at me as if it were directed specifically at me. It was humiliating, and I barely held back tears as I struggled to read words that felt like accusations. After everyone read their passages, Irina began discussing the meaning of each text, lingering particularly long on mine. She talked about the importance of obedience and not putting one's desires above God's will. With each word, I felt anger and resentment growing inside me. I wanted to get up and leave, but I knew it would only worsen the situation. Then she suggested praying for our family so we could overcome trials and become more spiritual. We all stood, and she took our hands, leading a prayer aloud. I listened to her words, but my thoughts were far from the prayer. I thought about how drained I felt coping with this every day. When dinner finally ended, I felt exhausted. Mark seemed oblivious to the tension, which only added to my bitterness. Each dinner left me feeling like I was losing myself, suppressing my feelings and thoughts for the sake of peaceful coexistence with Irina. But I knew it couldn't go on like this forever. The worst were the Sundays. How could I forget those Sundays? Each one was unbearable. One such Sunday morning, when I dreamed of a quiet day, she announced she would hold Sunday school right in our home. I was shocked, but I knew objecting would be futile. She gathered all the children from the neighborhood, including our nephews, and turned the living room into a classroom. In the center was Irina with a Bible in her hands, surrounded by a circle of chairs, each occupied by a child eagerly awaiting. She began with the story of Noah and the ark, her eyes shining as she spoke about obedience to God's word. Then the children started drawing their versions of the ark. One little boy, Tommy, drew an ark without animals. Irina, seizing the moment, declared that his ark resembled a life without faith, empty and meaningless. Tommy looked at his drawing, and I could see his smile fade. I felt sorry for him. Every time Irina addressed me for a comment, I felt tension growing inside me. I tried to respond as neutrally as possible to avoid further religious debates. However, her scrutinizing gaze made me feel like I was on trial. After the lesson, when the children dispersed, Irina took me by the hand and said I needed to participate more actively in the spiritual upbringing of the youth. She assured me it would help me find the true path. At that moment, I just nodded, but inside I was seething with indignation. I couldn't understand why I had to follow the path she chose for me. Those dreadful Sunday gatherings drained me of all my strength. Sunday was supposed to be my main day off, but I was obliged to spend it on religious education. On Monday mornings, I went to work exhausted from not having rested on Sunday, yet relieved that at least at work I could feel some peace and quiet. And then there was Easter. Easter, supposed to be a time of joy and renewal, but for me, it turned into a nightmare. Irina always took this holiday very seriously, and every year she organized hours-long prayers and rituals meant to purify and bring us closer to God. That particular year was especially tough. Irina decided we all had to strictly observe Lent, which meant complete abstinence from meat and dairy. Mark and I had already tried gently explaining to her that due to my health, I needed to adhere to a special diet, but she ignored it. She insisted that a true sacrifice required trials, and that my physical needs were a test of my spiritual strength. On Easter morning, she made us all rise at dawn to participate in a prayer service. I remember standing in the cold outside the church while she prayed so loudly and passionately it seemed like she alone was communing with the heavens. After the service, she hosted a gathering at home where we were supposed to share our reflections on the meaning of Easter. When it was my turn, she insisted I speak about my spiritual awakening. But what could I say? My heart was full of hurt and exhaustion from her pressure. I spoke about the importance of family and support, hinting that spiritual awakening doesn't come through coercion. Irina just glared at me angrily. Once, I fell ill. Nothing serious, I initially thought, just a cold. But my condition quickly worsened, and I began to feel real weakness and pain. In any other family, the first thing they would do is call a doctor, but not in ours, not with Irina. She believed in the idea of prayer healing. God is testing you, He will show you the way through suffering, she told me when I asked Mark to buy medicine. Mark seemed hesitant but didn't want to defy his mother. Irina started conducting prayer sessions over me. She prayed for hours, sprinkled me with holy water, read passages from the Bible while I lay on the couch, suffering in pain. With each passing day, I felt worse. Irina was relentless. This is a test for your soul. You must embrace it, she would say every time I tried to explain again that I needed a doctor. It was hard for me to believe that in those moments she really cared about me. My condition worsened, and one night I realized I could no longer endure it. I called the hospital and summoned an ambulance. The doctor said that if I had waited another day, there could have been serious complications. After that incident, I had a serious falling out with Mark and Irina. I explained that prayers cannot replace medical care and that their reluctance to call a doctor could have cost me my life. Irina was unyielding. You simply lack sufficient faith, she declared. After that incident, things were relatively normal for about a month. It felt like Irina had calmed down, and for a moment I thought reason had finally prevailed. But no. One day, returning home from work, I discovered that Irina had initiated a new ritual. It started with her announcing that an unclean spirit had taken residence in our home, and that only deep religious purification could save us all. I didn't even understand what she meant until I saw what was happening inside. The front door was open, and Irina, dressed in a white robe, stood with a censer emitting smoke. The entire house was draped with strange fabrics, and candles stood in the corners. She walked through each room, whispering prayers and sprinkling holy water. When she reached my bedroom, I saw that my personal belongings, books, and even photographs of our loved ones were thrown onto the floor to make room for light. I tried calmly asking her what led her to this decision. She stared at me with her piercing eyes and said it was for the good of the whole family, that I should be grateful for her care. But I couldn't understand how disrupting my personal space could be considered caring. Mark was away on a business trip at the time, and I felt like I was left alone to deal with this chaos. It was hard to watch Irina handle my things so disrespectfully, so sure that she was doing something important and necessary. In the kitchen, I found my cookbook stacked up, ready to be burned because, in her view, they could attract wrong energies. Every step in the house reminded me that my personal space, preferences, and beliefs were completely disregarded. I had to gather my things, put them back in place, trying to restore some semblance of order after her purification. I don't know how I managed it, but after all those rituals and purifications, Irina suddenly shifted her focus to my motherhood. She took it upon herself to help Mark and me conceive a child, even though we were already trying and saw it as our personal matter. She insisted she knew how to help us and that all we needed was a bit of divine intervention. One evening, when Mark was at work, she came to me with a bottle of holy water. She said it was special water blessed by a local priest and that it would help me conceive. All I needed to do was rub it in specific places. I tried to explain to her that Mark and I preferred to rely on science and medicine in such matters. Irina silently slammed the door and left my room, and we never revisited that topic again. Years later, I gave birth to our daughter, little Mia. She was a ray of light in our lives, and I tried to shield her from all hardships. As she grew up, I strictly forbade Irina from interfering in her upbringing, especially regarding religion. Irina could watch over her, but that was the extent of her role. I wanted Mia to grow up free from all those religious dogmas that had weighed so heavily on me. One day, Mia fell ill. Just a common cold, but I always worried about her health. As usual, Irina insisted on her way, prayers, holy water, and folk remedies. I firmly refused, saying we would treat her only with proven methods. But Irina persisted, her fanaticism becoming aggressive. On the day Mia got worse, I rushed to the pharmacy for medicine. Irina stayed home with Mia, and I hoped she would just watch over her. But when I returned, Mia was already vomiting. Her temperature had risen to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. I urgently called an ambulance. The doctors arrived quickly and took her to intensive care. Later, I learned that Irina had given Mia holy water that had been sitting in the basement for over a year and had gone moldy. The water was murky green, and I couldn't believe she had resorted to this. Mia suffered severe poisoning, and the doctors fought for her life, but couldn't save her. This loss broke me. I looked at Irina, who insisted she had acted from the best intentions, and I couldn't find the strength to even scream at her. Her conviction in the rightness of her actions was unwavering, and that terrified me the most. Mia was my everything, and now she's gone because of Irina's blind fanaticism. I couldn't believe what had happened. Every day, I asked myself why I couldn't protect my daughter. Instead of admitting guilt, Irina began to blame me. She claimed it happened because of my sins, because I didn't go to church and didn't believe in God. She said it with such conviction that I simply couldn't believe it. I remember one evening, sitting in the kitchen, staring into space, when Irina came up to me and said, "This is all your fault. God punished you for your disbelief. If you had gone to church and prayed, Mia would be alive." I snapped then, screaming like a madwoman, and Mark barely managed to pull me away. I left home, unable to hear her accusations anymore. Mark stayed with her. He was shattered too, but tried to hold on for both of us. When I returned, I said I had decided to divorce and would file the papers against my mother-in-law. Now Mark is trying to persuade me to withdraw the statement. Interestingly, he hasn't mentioned anything about the divorce. Who was I living this life with?